In the blood-soaked history of imperial Rome, where cruelty was currency and madness often wore a crown, few stories drip with as much decadence, depravity, and outright gore as that of the boy emperor Heliogabalus. He was not a ruler in the traditional sense. He was a 14-year-old high priest turned emperor, thrown into the most powerful position on earth, and he treated it less like a throne and more like a stage for personal chaos. Rome, already desensitized by centuries of violence, was unprepared for what was to come. A regime so bizarre, so offensive, and so utterly deranged that even hardened senators whispered of curses, omens, and divine punishment. Heliogabalus didn't just break rules. He set them on fire, danced naked in the ashes, and declared himself both emperor and empress of Rome. He married a man in public, attempted to castrate himself, dressed as a goddess, and replaced military advisors with dancers, magicians, and lovers plucked from the gutter. His palace became a playground of human suffering, a place where guests were trapped in rooms with wild animals, slaves were executed for sport, and nobles feared being fed to lions for looking bored at dinner. He once invited guests to a feast, only to crush them to death beneath a slow avalanche of rose petals. He demanded human sacrifices to ancient gods, ordered the torture of priests, and forced citizens to watch, not in amphitheaters, but in private dining rooms. Rome, a city built on blood, began to choke on its own appetite. Even the Senate, numb to horror, finally recoiled. At the age of just 18, Heliogabalus was dragged through the streets by his own guards, stabbed dozens of times, dismembered, and thrown into a public sewer. His severed head was paraded through the city, a reminder that no amount of silk, gold, or divine titles could protect a madman from the blade. This is not the story of an emperor. It's the story of a cult leader in a crown, a teenage sadist, a walking scandal who turned the Roman Empire into a grotesque cabaret of cruelty. This is the tale of Heliogabalus, Rome's bloodiest joke and history's most obscene punchline. Rome, that ancient engine of order, conquest, and cold-blooded efficiency, had always tolerated eccentric emperors. It had even survived a few madmen. But what Heliogabalus brought to the imperial palace wasn't just madness. It was theater, absurd, sacrilegious, and, at times, lethally entertaining. He declared that Rome's traditional gods were obsolete and announced that his sun god, Elagabal, would now reign supreme. Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, demoted. Their statues were dragged through the streets and forced to marry Elagabal's sacred black stone in a series of ceremonies so offensive that even the most jaded Roman priests reportedly wept. He built a massive temple on the Palatine Hill, where he performed blood rituals in full drag. Flowing silks, makeup, golden heels. Senators were forced to watch these ceremonies, some while gagging behind their togas, others pretending to smile as goats bled out at the altar. Heliogabalus replaced Rome's elite generals and administrators with his lovers, dancers, and mystics. He offered government positions to actors and prostitutes, appointed a charioteer as the city's chief magistrate, and once tried to make his pet lion a senator, until it mauled 2 slaves and threw off the vote. The imperial palace transformed into a fever dream of sexual excess and calculated humiliation. He held feasts where guests were fed fake food, live animals, or nothing at all, just to watch their reactions. He flooded banquet halls with wine and perfume until people collapsed. He invited nobles to dine, then locked them inside with wild leopards. The few who escaped were rewarded with more invitations. And then came the roses. In what may be his most legendary moment of lethal showmanship, Heliogabalus invited dozens of guests to a grand dinner party. They ate, drank, laughed, until a hidden mechanism in the ceiling released an avalanche of rose petals. Not a few, tons. Beautiful, soft, and deadly. Many suffocated under the sheer weight of floral excess. A massacre disguised as luxury. The survivors were expected to applaud. He laughed. They clapped. Rome held its breath. Behind the curtains, panic was growing. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite bodyguards, were furious. The Senate had gone silent, and even his grandmother, the very woman who had orchestrated his rise to power, began to realize that she had not created a ruler, but unleashed a curse. But Heliogabalus didn't slow down. If anything, he grew bolder. He married at least 5 times, including one union with a Roman athlete and another with a Vestal virgin, a sacred priestess whose vow of chastity was supposed to be inviolable. Breaking that vow was punishable by death, unless, of course, you were sleeping with the emperor or becoming his empress. He allegedly tried to surgically remove his own genitals, demanded doctors find a way to give him a vagina, and paid fortunes to anyone who could help him become fully female. For Heliogabalus, gender wasn't a concept. It was a costume, a performance, and sometimes a weapon. The city that had conquered the known world was now ruled by a teenage priest who dressed like a goddess, prayed like a maniac, and murdered like a poet. And Rome was getting tired of the show. By the end, even his own guards had stopped pretending. The Praetorian Guard, those elite warriors sworn to protect the emperor, had become little more than well-dressed prisoners, forced to witness their sovereign prance through the palace in golden heels and silk veils, demanding to be addressed as Lady of the Empire. They had watched friends be executed for sighing too loudly at dinner, or for bringing the wrong incense to his morning sacrifices. Heliogabalus had turned Rome into a divine circus, but no one was laughing anymore, not even him. In 222 AD, he made one final fatal mistake. He attempted to name his young cousin, Alexander Severus, as co-emperor, not out of kindness, but control. Alexander was everything Heliogabalus was not. Calm, polite, Roman. The people adored him. The soldiers respected him, and that made him dangerous. So Heliogabalus changed his mind. He ordered Alexander executed. Quietly. No spectacle this time. Just a quick disappearance like snuffing out a candle. But the guard refused. They didn't whisper. They didn't scheme. They simply turned on him. The boy emperor, still just 18, tried to flee. He ran through the palace like a terrified animal. Makeup smudged, jewels clattering against the marble, his silk robe soaked in sweat. Some say he hid in a closet. Others say he begged. What we know for sure is that they found him, clutching his mother, Julia Soemias, like a child trying to crawl back into the womb. They stabbed him, again and again, so many times his body stopped resembling a human form. They killed his mother too, for good measure. Then, like a final joke, they dragged his mutilated corpse through the streets of Rome. The crowd did not mourn. There were no prayers, no eulogies, just laughter, silence, and maybe, for the first time in years, a breath of relief. His body was thrown into the Tiber, but the river spat him out. So they buried it, dug it up again, and finally tossed it into the Cloaca Maxima, the city's ancient sewer. A fitting end, they thought, for the boy who had turned Rome into a toilet. No tomb, no statue, no shrine, just a legacy carved into the nightmares of history. And yet, centuries later, his name still lingers, not as a ruler, but as a cautionary tale, a legend of decadence unchained, of power given to a boy priest who mistook cruelty for ceremony and spectacle for strength. Heliogabalus didn't just fall. He exploded, and Rome, that ancient monster, simply blinked and moved on. Rome tried to forget him. They scrubbed his name from monuments, melted down his statues, and issued edicts banning all mention of his reign. The Senate declared damnatio memoriae, the Roman version of cancel culture, only with chisels and fire. To them, Heliogabalus was not just dead. He had to be unremembered. But monsters don't vanish that easily. For centuries, his legacy leaked back through the cracks, whispered by chroniclers, embellished by enemies, immortalized by artists who couldn't resist the twisted beauty of a boy emperor gone mad. Some called him the first transgender ruler in history. Others, the ultimate example of what happens when power and youth collide without resistance. Some saw a lunatic in a dress. others as symbol, decadent, tragic, seductive, and doomed. He became a mirror, a warning, a myth. In the Renaissance, painters resurrected him in lurid oils, reclining in silks, surrounded by naked slaves and bleeding roses. In Victorian times, he became a grotesque footnote in the history of moral collapse, a flamboyant freak show before the word freak had even been invented. And today, he's still here in films, books, operas, essays, and nightmares. Because even buried under centuries of lies and exaggerations, Heliogabalus remains unforgettable. Not because he ruled well, not because he built or conquered or created, but because for a brief, horrifying moment, he held the heart of the world's greatest empire in his manicured hands and squeezed it until it bled perfume. Heliogabalus was never meant to rule. He was a spectacle, a jest, a cosmic prank played by history itself. A boy draped in silks who dared to wear a crown heavier than his sanity. His reign was chaos wrapped in velvet, madness scented with rose petals, and power that slipped through his fingers like blood. But perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. Empires don't fall because of the monsters they crown. They fall because the monsters reveal what was already rotting inside. Rome didn't die with Heliogabalus. It died because it was sick, a decaying giant drunk on its own hubris and excess, waiting for a boy priest in heels to show everyone just how fragile its throne really was. So, as we close the pages on this gruesome chapter, remember this. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't those who roar the loudest, but those who laugh while the world burns beneath their feet. And sometimes that monster is us. Now, before we part, I want to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far this dark story has traveled.